Mummy brown, also known as Egyptian brown or caput mortuum, which quite literally translates to deadhead in medieval Latin, is a rich brown pigment sitting between burnt umber and raw umber in tint. The pigment was made from the flesh of Egyptian mummies, both human and feline, mixed with white pitch and myrrh. Egyptian mummies have been traced back somewhere around 5,000 years, but they only started becoming available in Europe in medieval times, primarily as a result of a belief in their medicinal qualities. This belief appears to have been based loosely on the ancient Greeks' medical use of pitch or bitumen, a dark substance which oozed from the earth in Persia and various other places in the Middle East. The Persian word for bitumen was mum or mummia. Variants of these words came to be applied to the bitumen that soaked the shrouded corpses. Ultimately, these words began being applied to the preserved bodies themselves, thus accounting for the name mummy, which has become familiar to us today. By the 16th century, despite legal restrictions, exporting mummies from Egypt to Europe to be ground up and used as medicine was a big business. Mummy powder was said to have a mystical curative potency and was sold in European apothecaries to be applied to the skin or mixed into food and drinks. The pigment began being mass-produced in shops across Europe. In 1712, a Parisian art supply shop even called itself à la mummy and sold paints, varnishes, and incense. Collection and distribution businesses were established, and since large profits were to be made, many foreigners, English, Spanish, French, German, and others began to trade in mummies, exporting complete bodies or packages of fragmented tissue from Cairo and Alexandria. Tombs were ransacked, and as many mummies as could be obtained were broken into pieces for the purpose of sale. Both locals and visitors dug up tombs and transported the mummies to Cairo, where they were sold for very small amounts. Inevitably, abuse quickly crept into the mummy trade. When genuine ancient mummies became too scarce or difficult to obtain, suppliers coped with the demand by resorting to using the corpses of condemned criminals. Apart from their medical use, mummies became somewhat of an attraction in themselves. Such mummy remnants would commonly be part of a gentleman's cabinet of curiosities, with one little small collection being described as including items as diverse as 2 ribs of a whale, a pelican, the hand of a mermaid, and the hand of a mummy. The demand for mummies was at an all-time high during the Victorian era, partly because Napoleon's campaign in Egypt and Syria had renewed interest in ancient civilizations. They would attend unwrapping parties. Unwrapping parties were exactly what they sound like. Victorians would get together, have some food and drinks, and then proceed to unwrap a mummy. As bizarre as this sounds, it was English surgeon Thomas Pettigrew who sort of pioneered this bizarre form of entertainment. Pettigrew was a remarkable scientist who had vaccinated Queen Victoria and would eventually write some of the most in-depth books of the time about mummies and ancient medicine. Pettigrew's first unwrapping took place in front of a group of physicians in 1821, but by the 1830s he was unwrapping mummies in front of spectators that were more interested in the shock value than the scientific value. Eventually, he made the parties smaller and more private, and other well-to-do members of Victorian society started to imitate him. Mummy unwrappings didn't really stop until X-rays came along and made it possible for historians and scientists to take a closer look without disturbing the wrappings. Mummy brown also became a favorite shade of the Pre-Raphaelites. While we don't know for certain which paintings from this time period were created using mummy brown, Eugene Delacroix, Sir William Beechley, and Edward Burne-Jones are all recorded as having purchased it. And it has often been suggested that Martin Drolling's interior of a kitchen uses the pigment. However, few works have been tested for its presence because the process would be destructive. The paint eventually fell out of popularity with the Pre-Raphaelites when the artists became more aware of its origins. Edward Burne-Jones was reported to have buried his tube of mummy brown in his garden when he discovered how it was made. Scientists also started to take a more serious interest in mummies, and more people started to realize these were actual human remains that should be handled with a bit more respect. By the start of the 20th century, mummy brown had largely ceased production in its traditional form, due to the continued decline in the supply of available mummies as well as a significant drop in demand and bad press. Today, genuine mummy brown cannot be bought from any paint shop. In 1964, Time magazine reported that the sole distributor of the pigment, London color maker C. Robertson, had run out of mummies a few years prior. The managing director of C. Robertson told Time magazine, quote, "We might have a few odd limbs lying around somewhere, but not enough to make any more paint." A tube of mummy brown pigment purchased from C. Robertson in the early 1900s is on display at the Forbes Pigment Collection of the Harvard Art Museum. Recently, in early 2023, British museums have announced they will stop using the word mummy to describe the remains of ancient Egyptians. It has been said that the term is dehumanizing to those who have died and that mummy is an unwelcome throwback to the British colonial past. Instead, they will be using the terms mummified remains of or a mummified person whenever possible. In her book, Color, A Natural History of the Palate, Victoria Finlay writes, "The Egyptians mummified their dead because they believed that one day the Ka or spirit double would return. If this is the case, the Ka might be kept busy for years, trotting sadly around the museums and art galleries of the world."